Hi, welcome to the Startup Leader Show, where we learn lessons from leading startup founders and executives. I'm your host, Lisa Dreher. I'm excited to introduce our guest for today, Alan Gottlieb. He is the managing director of Gottlieb International Group, and I really want to welcome you to the show, Alan.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here, Lisa. And of course, as you know, what we do is we publish Satellite Mobility World, which we've been publishing now for 6 years, which is a monthly online magazine that focuses on startups and the use of satellite in mobility markets. So we're read in about 45 countries around the world, and it's extremely popular in the satellite industry.
Oh, it absolutely is. And I would encourage anyone out there that's listening to go and subscribe, because this is an amazing monthly publication that gives so much information on what's happening in the satellite mobility market. It's fantastic.
And it's also free.
Hey, even better, right? So
Yes.
actually, maybe you can give our audience a little bit of background on Gottlieb International and how you came to start your own company, and just kind of a little bit of background.
Well, I've been in mobility and satellite mobility almost 20 years. And I got in it through it for a bunch of consulting and research that I did for several companies who were interested in satellite companies that were interested in serving the mobility market. And so that involved traveling to Europe, visiting with many ship owners, talking to them about their needs for communication on their vessels, all of this. And what I learned through the consulting, through the initial consulting, I turned into a consulting practice for others. I wrote articles in Sat News. I wrote articles in Digital Ship and many of the industry publications. I became a real authority from what I'd learned on why ships and airplanes and other mobility types of mobility want satellite communication. And so after writing so many articles and speaking at so many events, we did some live events as well in Singapore and in Greece and in Norway. After doing so much of that, I decided, being an undergraduate English major with an MBA and a bunch of venture capital experience early in my career, that now was the time for me to start my own magazine. So that's essentially how it started. I started on a very clever online platform that made it very easy to do all of it. And initiated the first edition in January of 2016. And the magazine became very well known, especially for my controversial business views that were not the same, the same sugar-coated promotional material. I came down on a lot of what I consider to be very bad strategic judgments by some of the new companies in the industry at that time. One of them was Inmarsat, which had made a huge number of mistakes. And so with that, I became very famous as a critique of business strategies within the satellite and a lot of these new ventures.
Yeah, well, it can definitely be unpopular to be contrarian. So
not always, only among the people you're criticizing.
Well, this is true. This is true. So why don't you talk to me a little bit about some of the trends that you're keeping a close eye on at the moment?
Well, there are really two kinds of trends that we're looking at. One is a bunch of wildly speculative ventures, which of course are the ventures we've seen, like OneWeb and Starlink and AST Science and some of these other wild ventures, which I can talk a little bit about, and ventures that really make a lot of good practical sense. What I'm talking about is smaller ventures that attack specific and easily definable markets. Mm-hmm. And this is where you really begin to see a difference between these two types of companies. If you take a look at the Starlinks of the world and you take a look at the OneWebs of the world, these ventures never clearly defined who exactly the target customer was. I'm not saying the target customer being someone who just doesn't have internet. I'm saying going into the market, talking to each individual type of user and understanding their habits, whether they can afford the product, whether they want the product. We're talking about a venture founders having an intimate knowledge of who will buy and why.
Yeah.
If you apply that criteria to Starlink and you apply it to OneWeb, you realize that these folks never really had much of an idea of who the market was. Only as other O3B started, the other 3 billion. Who knows how much money they have? Who knows if they needed it? Who knows that if they even spoke the language, the popular language that are used on the internet? No. So essentially, we have ventures where people want to commit billions of dollars just to find out if there really is a market. Which is very interesting is the fact that OneWeb was originally financed not by VCs, unless you really want to call SoftBank a VC, but by a lot of companies that stood to benefit by getting big fat contracts for building it. So, so obviously these fellows, these companies, they didn't have much risk at all. It was the other investors who didn't see any benefit out of it. The SoftBank maybe, and not too many others that didn't see any real benefit. So you had basically a situation where it wasn't really seeded based on the practicality of the investment, mostly on the contracts it would generate.
Well, so let's, I guess, kind of turn the table here and talk about what is it that will make ventures like these successful? What are those success factors for the satellite industry startups?
Well, the factors I look for, and I spent a couple of years around the venture capital community in it, and you learn some really interesting things. What you want to see is a really defined market. Like, let's talk about some companies that do have defined markets. Rocket Labs, for example. Here's a very good example of a company that has defined markets. You know how many satellites are going to be launched. You know who most of the competitors are. You know they've demonstrated their technology and they're an early leader in the field. You also know they have government contracts. They've been able to get quite a few government contracts. They put satellites into orbit. That is a sensible venture. You know who the customer is, how much they're willing to pay, the size of the market, okay?
Yeah.
That is absolutely critical in any venture. And one thing I really want to make clear, space ventures are not any different than any other venture. The criteria I'm talking about apply to any venture. Just because a venture like Starlink or a venture like OneWeb is mesmerizing, wow, everyone thought, isn't it cool that we're going to give internet to everybody? Now, that's very dangerous for investors. It's dangerous because and it's especially dangerous when these SPAC deals, to put something like that in front of the public. They look at Elon Musk. He's been very successful, and he's a brilliant guy in terms of SpaceX, and he's done well with Tesla. But so that makes the prospects of this look very exciting. But the fact is, just because he's been successful in two of these ventures doesn't necessarily mean that this consumer venture, which is different from anything that he has done, is going to be successful. So we have to get beyond the excitement of space, and we have to start looking at these ventures in terms of the markets and the needs they fill.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think of SPACs? I mean, you mentioned that.
Yeah, SPACs. SPACs, I don't like SPACs because what they're tending to do is to put some companies into the market that are not ready for the public market. In fact, they're not even, they're barely venture capital deals, let alone ready for public investors. You know, one of my favorites that I've written a lot about is AST and Science SPAC.
Yeah.
This is a venture that's never put a satellite into orbit. It's a venture that has no FCC at this moment. It has no FCC license. Its technology has never been tested in space. The market is unclear. There are problems with interference. NASA has objected to its orbits because of potential collisions with NASA's A-Train satellites. It's going to put up a satellite that's 70 feet across and not hardly a few centimeters thick. So it exists purely on paper. It's purely very, very speculative. So while it may be perfectly all right for venture capitalists to invest in this, and some big companies are taking a shot, including Vodafone and American Tower. And he has some bright people, and it's an intriguing concept. But in my view, this thing you need to launch a prototype satellite, demonstrate the technology works in space, have a license, have the interference and collision issues resolved before you put it into the public market. And that's the kind of a SPAC that makes me very, very nervous.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and especially if people, you know, and the public investors are not aware of how to, I guess, look at those businesses and determine whether there's something really going to happen here, you know, how real it is, right?
Well, the ironic thing is that the founders of the SPACs don't know that much more than the public. The satellite industry is enormously complex. The technologies many are cutting edge, and some are still not proven. As they always say, the devil is in the details. And if the founders of the SPAC are not from the satellite industry and have intensive experience in these kinds of ventures, how can you expect the public that looks and says, wow, this is exciting, Musk is involved in it, or all these big companies have invested in it and seeded it, well, must be good.
Yeah.
Didn't we learn from the Theranos adventure and others and the Madoff deal that just because somebody who we think might have credibility invested in it, you get a long chain of people who follow the initial one investor who bells the cat, and the other followers all think that the next guy in front knows something, and pretty soon you end up with a Theranos. The whole assumption collapses.
Yeah.
Basically, you have to be sure that the assumptions, what really makes most business fail is they build their business on an assumption that is not true. And then they sell the idea to themselves over and over again until they believe it themselves.
Yeah. Drinking their own Kool-Aid, right?
Exactly.
That's what they say.
They're drinking their own Kool-Aid. Can you imagine with Motorola and the original Iridium concept that went bankrupt, the old one in the beginning, if a young, smart 25 or 30-year analyst had walked into the CEO of Motorola and said, you guys are trying to sell to Arctic explorers. That's a tiny market. This thing is not going to fly. Which door do you think they would have thrown him out of?
Yeah, no doubt.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned founders. What would be one piece of advice that you would give founders as they are, you know, building a new space-related startup, or or trying to take it to the next level, get that seed funding, what have you?
I would say that the most important thing that you have are projections that are reasonable. There are too many people that think that inflating massive projections of revenue will get you investors easier. And nothing could be further from the truth. What will happen when you go to a VC and make your projections as to your revenue curve? They're going to look at existing companies in the same niche, the closest ones that resemble you. And they are going to look at how long it took them to get where they are, what the growth curve looked like, what the margins looked like. One company that will remain nameless that I know projected $1.5 billion revenue stream in the third year, which the nearest competitor was in business for over almost 10 years and reached 100 million, selling a similar product.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of absurd, and it's the kind of misconception. Founders think that because they make a big fat projection, that's going to, investors want a real projection. They want something that makes sense. And they're looking for 10-to-1 return on their money in 5 years. Other things I think they look for, and I know that I look for, is I look for companies that are going early down the risk curve, that to push the risk curve down quite a bit on their own before coming for VC money. I'm talking about making sure a technology works. I'm talking about companies that have firm orders for their product or have sold some of their product. The less you come with to see a VC, if you don't have customers, if your technology is not proven, you can expect, even if they like the idea and the concept and they like the startup team, which is critical, you can expect that they're going to they're going to want 80% equity in the business because of the high risk curve, the extreme risk curve. Sell some of it, get past the technology, and the amount of equity you'll have to give up to get funding is going to be less than if you had none of those factors proven.
Yeah. So what are some of your pieces of advice then for doing that, I guess, bootstrapping up until that point, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're suggesting, I think, right?
Right. Right. There are ways to bootstrap. You have to understand another misconception about raising money is because I only need $100,000 or I only need $300,000. That's going to be easy. That is not true. The thing is, it is not true because VCs will generally not be interested in investing in companies that need such a small amount of money. The reason is they all want to have someone that sits on the board of the companies they invest in. And many of them have hundreds of millions of dollars in money to invest. And maybe only 10, 15, 20 partners. They can't sit on the board of hundreds of companies.
Yeah.
So they have to make sure their investments are large enough that they can take an active part in the management role.
Sure. That makes sense.
Where do you raise money in those months? There are ways of doing it. There's borrowing. There are a lot of people, there are angel networks of wealthy investors. They're good places to look. Kickstarter, has been very, very popular.
Yeah.
You can go through your contacts in your business. You can go through accountants, lawyers, people that know wealthy people. There are lists of family offices, angels who put in, wealthy investors who put in money in relatively smaller amounts to help seed a venture. But that's where you have to go. You can't get VC money unless you're looking for several millions of dollars.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important, right, to remember that it doesn't end at that initial round of funding, whether that's angel funding or VC funding or what have you. What do you think founders need to keep in mind once they've closed an initial seed round or a Series A round, what have you, kind of whichever direction they end up going? What is it important? What important things do they need to keep in mind?
What they need to keep in mind is the same thing that when they get money, typically money is doled out based on milestones. And throughout the throughout the money raising process, you're going to be setting milestones of progress. And you have to come close and certainly meet those milestones in order to get continuing investor support. And that goes after the first round funding, you go for the second round funding. You're not going to continue to get funding rounds unless you have meet funding rounds, unless you've demonstrated a track record of meeting your timeline and milestones toward getting the business to a point where it can actually produce money, where you have your first customers and your first sales.
Sure. Makes sense. Okay, I want to close things out with one more question. That is, and I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are going to be on this.
Okay.
If you could make one prediction about the future of the space industry commercialization, what would it be?
It would be that the future of space commercialization is in the companies that have very focused and achievable in the relatively short to midterm markets and objectives. And that means, like some of these, like, for example, I like companies like Kepler Communications. They're a little company. They put up their first CubeSat and they started making money with their CubeSat. Okay. I like that. I like the SAR companies, the synthetic aperture radar companies. The government buys tons of that data. There's plenty market for that. There's plenty of market for it. You will be successful in space investments by building a portfolio of smaller companies that have targeted, highly achievable goals and markets that are after tangible objectives, rather than investing in mega constellations that require billions of dollars before you ever have a chance of seeing if they're going to be successful.
Gotcha. Okay. So as these things come to pass, we're going to have to get together again and talk about them.
Well, I hope you would have had we could certainly talk about these. There are many, many issues in the VC world, and there are many let me make this point. There are many things in the venture capital area that really defy common sense at the highest level if you're not familiar with the way they operate. Just as I mentioned, raising a little bit of money is not easy, and you can't go to VC. It's not easier to raise a little bit. And there are a lot of other perceptions of raising money that are quite outside of a lot of early stage venture founders' expertise and understanding. And they need to know where to go, what kind of venture firms to go after, who invests in it, how to target those firms. All of those things are complicated, but you need to go through them in order to be successful.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I really want to thank you for being here today. It sounds like we have at least, 5 more shows that could come out of this conversation.
Yeah, VC is a very interesting business. It really isn't. And assessing companies that are worthy of investment in this sector. But again, it's no different here than it is in other business. The same basic principles of investment apply. They haven't been suspended for space.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. And hey, Don, I see your comment. I will connect you with Alan. So after the show here. So thanks for sending that in. Anyway, thank you so much for being here, and we will definitely get together again. Okay, Alan?
Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Have a great day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.